So basically, my mother's telling me about this rash knight called Balin, and I thought, oh, is that the... No, we're talking about... Anyway, Balin. So Balin wants to be a knight in Arthur's court, but he can't control his temper or learn common courtesy, and he's hot-headed, and he first of all strikes somebody and then at another point kills someone in Arthur's court, and he's banished. And he wants to go out and do some good deed to redeem himself, and his idea is that so he discovers there's an invisible knight that's been killing people, and he promises the widow of one of the victims of the invisible knight that he will seek revenge. So he's got this quest. And then he finds his way into this mysterious castle, which wasn't even there the last time he passed. It's clearly under some kind of enchantment. But he goes in and he believes the invisible knight to be there and to be visible at that point. So the king of the castle, who is indeed, as we discover, the Fisher King and the keeper of the Hallows, has a rule of complete peace and hospitality within the house, that if you come and share at his table, then you lay your weapons aside. So Balin has to leave his sword at the door, but he conceals the dagger. My mother's telling me the story. He eventually sees the person he thinks is the invisible knight, and in the midst of the banquet, he attacks and stabs him, and his dagger breaks, and there's uproar. And he's broken all the laws of hospitality. So the king himself, whose hospitality has been so offended, pursues him. And my mother described this to me. He's running through the castle, and he's weaponless, and he wants to defend himself. And he thinks, well, I'm in a castle. You know, there'll be shields and axes and swords and things on the wall, but there's nothing. And, of course, he goes out deeper and deeper into the heart of it. And my mother says he could always hear the footsteps of the pursuing king, but he could also hear voices, high, fell voices on the air saying, go no further, you know, stop, man of blood, turn back, you know, all this stuff. And my mum really built it up. And then he comes to this threshold. And again, the voices are clearer. And he steps across the threshold and he finds himself in the Grail Chapel, but of course he doesn't really know what that is. But then the voices say very clearly, fall on your feet, the place where you are is holy ground, do not look up. And he doesn't, of course, on his feet. He looks and he sees the chalice, and above it he sees hovering in the air a spear with 3 drops of blood continually falling from its point. And he's told again to step back. And I say, oh, Mum, don't tell me. You know? And of course, he can hear the pursuing king. And my mum tells me, and he stepped across into the very sanctuary. And with impious hands, he seized the spear and he turned around. And his host, the king, was coming to him, Pele's the Fisher King. And he took the spear and he ran it and he wounded the king deep in the thigh. And at that moment, my mother said, all of that castle fell in. And he and the wounded king and the Grail itself were buried as though in a sepulchre for 3 days and 3 nights. And on the 3rd day, you know, the stones moved. Merlin had moved the stones, and Balin emerges into the light of day. And Merlin says, you have done an accursed thing. You have struck the dolorous blow. And then this was the bit that really got me. I'll never forget it. And Merlin says, this was the spear which the soldier Longinus used to pierce the heart of Christ. And it should never have been touched by impious hands. And indeed, my mother looked at me, she said, of course Merlin said that, because this was the spear that should have ended all the violence. This spear was the point of the long chain of hurts and hates and revenges that started when Cain slew Abel. And it always led to more hatred. But here at last, they pierced the heart of love, and Christ gave forgiveness. And of all the spears in the world, this is the one that should never have been turned to violence. Indeed, it should have been the end. And I'm going, but Mum, he didn't know, you know. And then this is the absolutely, and I suddenly realized there are some things that are holy, whether you know they're holy or not. And there are some things that are true, whether you subscribe to that truth or not. You know, if I mean to compare the sublime, you know, with the merely pleasant. I mean, if I've got a bottle of single malt on my table, it's there whether you think it's there or not. You know, and it's still whiskey, whatever your opinion of alcohol. So, but there we go. So my mum says, but Merlin says to him, because you have done this, the whole land for 3 counties wide is laid waste, because the king and the land are one. And as long as the wound of the king is unhealed, the wound of the land is unhealed. And the fish, my mother told me, the fish die in the rivers, and the crops fail on the ground, and the cows can't calf, and men and women can't bring forth children. And all is devastated. And Balin, she said, had to ride through that land for 3 days with everybody coming to the doors of their house and cursing him. And at this point, I couldn't stand it anymore. And I said, Mum, that's just, how could that be? He didn't even know what he was doing. How could there even be a world where one person, in such a rash way, did one kind of foolish person seeking their own ego or revenge? How could that have such a devastating effect on everything else and all this innocent people and the dead creatures? And my mother looked at me and she said, I was not going to offend this. She said, I told you this story because you need to know that you live in just such a world, that our world is like that too. And of course, this was only a year or so from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we were full of the threats of nuclear winter. And she said to me, your father and I had to think and pray about whether it was right to bring children into such a world as this, who might suffer such devastation, and in a way that we might not be able to prevent. But we did it because we had hope. And then she said to me, and Merlin spoke a word of hope to Balin too. And he told before Balin, he said, the land is cursed, it will remain the wasteland until the good night comes. And when the good night comes, and when the good night achieves the Grail, with the reverence which was totally absent in Balin, when the good knight achieves the Grail, then he will take the spear, and with the same spear that the king was wounded, the king will be healed, and the drops of blood, the drops of Christ's blood, will fall into the king's wound. And when he is healed, the wasteland will blossom. So, at least my mother, unlike T.S. Eliot, didn't leave me in the wasteland. But it was a kind of amazing, so obviously, so I'm telling you, so vividly, I've not forgotten it. Now, I learned a lot. I learned a lot on that day, and I will learn, including a kind of a realization of that peril is real, and even grown-ups can't entirely deal with it. But I also learned that story, that old, ancient story, knew more about my world than I did. That it knows stuff. And I've never lost that conviction that these stories know things we don't know or have forgotten.